Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining in. Welcome to Field to Bottle number 2. So this is every week on a Wednesday. We're going to be doing a bit of a small session about a different aspect of our business, going through everything from field to bottle. So we'll just wait a second and get some more people to join, and then we'll crack through it. No problem.
Over there.
Okay, great. So we'll start getting things moving along a bit now. So welcome to Field to Bottle number 2. This is all about, this is focusing on the farm. So last week we had Field to Bottle number 1, which focused on distillery projects 001 and 002. For this week, we're taking a step away from the whiskey and moving more towards and away from the bottle and moving more towards the whiskey. So you've got Jenny and Tom. So I'm Jenny. I'm joined by Tom, who is he's the co-founder of the Spirit of Yorkshire, along with David, who I'm sure you've probably all seen on different Facebook Lives that we've been doing and videos that we've been doing lately as well. I'm Jenny. I head up the marketing here. Don't be fooled by the fact that we've got different surnames now. One of the reasons that we're able to sit this close together at the moment is that Tom is actually my dad, and we're all living together up at the farm at the moment. So that's just to set the scene and the precedent as to why we're actually together here and not on 2 separate screens. So today we're talking all about the farm and how we farm. So quick introduction, Tom and I are generations 3 and 4 of Mellors who farmed at Hummonby Grange, though it's negligible whether I could be called a farmer just yet. And what we're going to be doing is just talking you through a bit about the history of the farm, why we grow barley, why we farm in the way that we farm, and kind of how the farm's evolved over the past 75 years now. We'll touch across lots of different topics. As before, please feel free to just bob any comments into the comment section just underneath the screen here, and we'll be able to pick those up and put them on, and we'll ask them away. We might not ask them straight away. We'll wait until they're relevant, and possibly even wait until the end if that's necessary. So thanks very much. And without further ado, I think Tom, I'll be referring to him as Tom now, not Dad, because it sounds much nicer. Tom, you're welcome. Tom, would you like to talk to us a bit about the farm and how it started, and kind of why Hummonby Grange is in the Mellor family to start with?
Okay. Right. Well, first of all, welcome everybody. This is my first appearance on Facebook, so I'm a bit of a novice at this. Hopefully we'll get through it without too many mishaps. Yeah, as Jenny said, we're generations 3 and 4 sitting here in front of you now. My grandfather bought the farm at the end of the Second World War. He moved the whole family over from industrial West Yorkshire for a better life over on the Yorkshire coast. So they arrived here on the 1st of May 1945, and my granddad farmed until the end of 1950s, late 1959. My father then took over from him and farmed until the mid 80s when I came back from college, university in 1981, and really sort of took over, I suppose, towards the middle to the late 1980s. I've been farming it ever since, together with my wife Jill, and it's a traditional East Yorkshire farm, or right on the cusp of actually East and North Yorkshire. The boundary runs along the bottom of the farm. Traditional walled farm as well, on chalky hills. Originally, before the enclosures, this part of the world was known as the sheep walks, because it wasn't deemed to be fit enough or fertile enough for arable crops, but that sort of changed with increasing agricultural revolution back in the 1800s, and now is a traditional Yorkshire farm.
Okay, so one of the reasons that the distillery and actually the brewery, which came prior to the distillery, was set up in the first place is because we've grown high quality malting barley here for decades. So I guess talk a bit more about why that chalky soil is so good. And actually I can just quickly jump in and using one of the flashy things that's on here. I can just show quick, which we had to dig a big hole on the farm recently. And actually what it proved was a really good sort of strata level picture of how much chalk there is. So you can see that there really isn't very much topsoil on the top of it. It very quickly goes down into chalk, and that's good and bad for a variety of different reasons.
Yep. Malting barley traditionally likes thin calcareous soils. It doesn't really do particularly well for the malting or the brewing business on big heavy soils, although you can manipulate the inputs to overcome that. Normally you would end up with too much nitrogen in the grain, which would then lead to haze problems in beer, and also reduces the extract of alcohol that you can get out of a particular batch of grain. So we're witnessed by the fact that we've got two major maltsters right on our doorstep. One at Knapton, which is towards Malton, just right on the edge of the Yorkshire Wolds on the Vale in the Vale of Pickering, and the other one is Muntons at Bridlington, which is just 10 miles away. Both of these two maltsters take an awful lot of barley from the Yorkshire Wolds and from elsewhere as well, and then export it literally all over the world. So it is recognised that this part of the world is one of the best areas for growing malting barley. As I said before, it likes thin calcareous soils, possibly droughty soils, and can withstand a bit of drought in the summer as well.
Yeah, so we're really free draining up here. So actually earlier in the year, when there were all the storms and there was so much standing water around, the Yorkshire Wolds we were in a really fortunate position because the fields drained quite quickly. So that wasn't really an issue for us. So now we could diverge into a couple of different paths. So let's just quickly talk about the type of barley that we're growing this year.
Or why we started. Why we started in the first place.
Yeah.
Well, back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, most of the farming industry was going through one of its cyclical downturns, and everybody was then starting to diversify and move their businesses in a different direction based on what they were good at and what the assets that they had. And that's, if you cast your mind back to that time, that's when most people started setting up farm shops, adding value to their own meat by butchering it, making cheese, converting barns into holiday cottages or commercial properties, setting up campsites, farm shops, delis, that sort of thing. And we were no different, really. And so I had to look at the enterprises that we had and the resources that we had on the farm. And of course, we just mentioned malting barley. The other thing that we do have is our own water supply. Now, most properties in the UK that have got their own water supply also have a main supply. But unfortunately, we don't have that. We've managed to evade the pipe laying people. I don't know quite how that happened, but we don't have mains water here. So we rely completely on borehole water, which is effectively sunk, which comes straight from the chalk.
In fact, I'm just going to jump in because one of my other posh little overlays that I've managed to do, actually, you can't quite see it from here, but just hidden.
So that's relevant then, Jen.
Just hidden down in the fold of that dale down there is the pump house, or the original pump house on the farm that was sunk in 1937.
Yep.
And it's been providing water to us ever since, and still provides a significant part of the water that we use up here on the farm today. And then we have another much less pretty and idyllic looking one just at the top of the farm as well.
So at the end of 2001, 2002, we were looking for ways to diversify, and it occurred to me that we've got the two major elements or ingredients that we need to make a decent beer. And after some investigation with a consultant, looking into the possibility of being able to set up a brewery, and having done some market research on the local towns and villages and cities around here, we set up the Woldtop Brewery in 2003. The aim was to add value to barley, effectively, and that's what we've been doing ever since. We produce a natural extension of that, of course, is then to move into distilling, because the first part of the brewing process and the first part of the malt distilling process are absolutely identical, effectively taking the sugar from the barley and converting it into alcohol, which then goes off in slightly different directions. So that's why we started, and that might be just a bit of useful background.
Yeah, so that's why the Spirit of Yorkshire Distillery came into being, and after the sort of initial idea nearly a decade ago now, the stills. You enlisted the help of Dr. Jim Swan and set up the stills, and all of that. The rest of that is history. But that's kind of taking us down into the distillery, which is something we'll cover off on topics on sort of future Wednesdays. So I guess now if we sort of cycle back to the barley, so why have we chosen the type of barley that we've chosen this year? Because there's lots of debate about different varieties.
Well, there's generally speaking, from a business point of view, you have to match the qualities of the barley for brewing and for distilling with the returns that you would get as a farmer. There's no point growing a particular variety that's got a small appeal, even though it might have a little niche following, if that means that the actual person that's growing that barley can't make a living. So it leads me that would lead me on to a particular topic that I want to talk about later on in terms of sustainability, but not just environmental sustainability. So what we do is we look at the varieties that are grown specifically and have been bred specifically for brewing and distilling. Now, back in the 1960s, there was a fantastic variety called Maris Otter came on the scene, and it really was groundbreaking because it was up to that point, all the malting varieties had been spring barley varieties, which were great for quality, but relatively low in yield. And so then the return to the farmer was not particularly great. And what they did, what the Flant breeders did then was to take one of the best malting barleys around and spring barleys and mix it, and breed it with a winter variety. And that brought Maris Otter onto the scene. Maris Otter was a great variety, and everybody was very, very pleased when that came along. And then it started to lose a bit of favour because of its disease resistance or its lack of disease resistance, even though it's a fantastic variety with which to brew. And it sort of fell out of favour, and then it was overtaken by other winter varieties. So going back, then there was Pearl and Halcyon as well. And we now have one or two other varieties that are grown in the winter, but predominantly we prefer to grow spring varieties. And so the varieties that we have been using up to press have been Concerto. For the last 4 or 5 years, we've grown Concerto, and it consistently has been the barley of choice of a lot of the distilleries up in Scotland and also the brewers in the UK as well. Last year, we then decided to have a little experiment because there's some indication that Concerto has been superseded from a yield point of view by several other varieties, one of which is called Laureate, and that's what we have grown this year exclusively. But last year we did about 20%, 25% of our barley acreage with Laureate so that we could compare the two, and I'm afraid to say that Laureate out-yielded the Concerto by a considerable margin, and although they've got very similar distilling and brewing characteristics, from our point of view, the yield outweighs those other factors, all other things being equal. So from a farming point of view, it's no good continuing to grow Concerto if there's an alternative variety which can actually leave you a better return. And
also had a good impact on the whiskey as well. I think that's Dad's definitely talking about things there from a farming point of view, but we've really found that the Laureate seem to work better for the whiskey as well. And I know from looking at other distilleries and seeing what they're talking about at the moment at this time of year when people have been planting their spring barley, that it does seem like Laureate's being used quite consistently around the UK, including Scotland and England and Ireland. So I guess now if we move on to a bit more of the specifics, well, that was quite specific too. Sorry if specific barley varieties aren't always your cup of tea. So a bit about the farm. So how people have farmed has obviously changed exponentially in the last century, especially even when you look at things from sort of harvesting practices during World War II and through to now. So we're doing things quite differently this year, or we're trialing things in quite a different way this year. Yep. So why don't you talk a bit more about that?
Okay. I suppose traditionally the idea of ploughing the land, turning it over so that you could have basically a fresh, clean start and bury the residue from the previous crop, which would then get imbibed into the soil, has been around for a long, long period of time. And when I was growing up, there was an old boy who works on the farm with us, and he had first started ploughing with horses in the 1920s, and had then seen everything through after the Second World War, and slightly before that, the introduction of tractors and things like that. And I learned to plough with him on a single one way plough, setting rigs and then taking out the furrows at the end of the particular rigs. And it's a bit of a labour of love, is that? And a lot of people still do it, and there are great competitions and are fantastic ploughmen and such. But it's not the easiest of things to do. And so the next logical step was then to have a reversible plough, which meant that you could just turn it over at the end and continue ploughing along the same mark rather than having to set the rigs and furrows. And of course, when you do that, the plough then becomes a little bit heavier, and so you need a slightly bigger tractor to pull it. And then because you've got a slightly bigger tractor to pull it, you need to go a little bit deeper, and you go a little bit wider, and you try to get more done in a day. So then you put an extra furrow on the back of the plough, and all of a sudden you end up with a great big tractor pulling a great big plough and turning over huge amounts of soil. Now that's been fine, and that's how we've been led to believe that's the right way to do it. The old boys, right at the very beginning, didn't plough more than about 2 inches deep, which today, in today's parlance, would be called minimally tilling the soil. And so we've got into this situation where you can end up with the weight of the tractor causes some sort of compaction in the subsoil, and then you've got to go slightly deeper. You've got to break that up. And so we've been disturbing more and more tons of soil on the surface for the last 30, 40 years increasingly, and we've been no exception to that. We've done exactly the same thing. We're now starting to look at whether that's a real way forward, especially as with all the talk of climate change. Every time you turn over the soil, you get mineralization of carbon and also nitrogen as well. And effectively, the carbon goes off into the atmosphere that has been locked in the soil, and the nitrogen, if there's no crop growing there, will actually effectively head south and go down into the water supply. So there's lots and lots of work going on these days, right at the moment, across agriculture. Very exciting times about exploring different ways of not tilling the soil or minimally tilling it, and also using cover crops to sequester carbon and to gather nitrogen during the period when the barley crop is not growing. The spring barley crop is in the ground for between 16 and 20 weeks of the year, which means that the rest of the year, the field is effectively empty. I know that's not a technical expression that anybody would want to have, but effectively that's it. So the idea of leaving bare stubbles after harvest and ploughing in the autumn and leaving the upturned soil to overwinter was great for making a frost mold and for actually breaking the soil down, but actually is now not considered to be quite as environmentally friendly as was once thought. So what we've done over the last couple of years is that, first of all, we've not removed any straw from the crop after the harvest. We've just chopped it, and we've then incorporated it into the soil. We've mixed it into the top of the soil, and then we've sown what's called a cover crop after that. So it's almost like a sort of intermediate crop between crops of spring barley. And generally speaking, that consists of things like legumes, certain cereals, phacelia, radishes, and that sort of thing, all doing a slightly different job, either sequestering nitrogen from the atmosphere and also taking in nitrogen from the atmosphere as well, and putting that into the root system and locking it up in the soil, which can then be used, generally speaking, to build up the soil for fertility for the following crops. It's been an interesting exercise, and over the last 2 or 3 years we've struggled with establishing the cover crop, because at the time of year when you've just harvested the spring barley, it tends to be very dry, and so we lack a little bit of moisture. And these crops, very small seeds, require quite a bit of moisture just to get them going and up and running. And I think we could safely say that in trying to do things the way that we've always done them with the machinery that we've always had, we've ended up losing moisture and almost being self-defeating by spending more money and getting a worse result. So now this last year, we've actually just direct drilled straight into the residue of the crop with a cover crop, and we now have gone through, once that cover crop has been destroyed in the spring, we're now gone through and just direct drilled straight into that as well with next year's spring barley. It's an interesting experiment, and I'm not 100% sure whether we've got it right yet, but we're trying.
So so just before you panic, that that we might have just experimented too much with all of our barley crop. We've actually only done a percentage of the barley crop has been direct drill, and the other percentage has been I guess conventionally established. So we're going to have some really interesting results to compare at the end of the year, also post harvest, to see what's happened and measuring the amount of carbon that's captured and everything like that. So be prepared come the autumn to hear quite a lot more about that and the results. And we promise we'll be honest.
We will, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, regardless of which way it seems to have gone. So that's kind of how we're farming at the moment and what we're thinking about, and that all ties into that overall distillery ethos that we have, which is about respecting tradition but doing things our own way. Dad's laughing.
I am just looking at one of my old university chums' questions.
I know, that's why you weren't supposed to look at those. So sorry if it looks like we're looking at the screen. We've got the comments coming up at the side just so that we can keep an eye on what's going on. So again, if you've got any questions as we're going through things, I know there was a lot of words there. Like sequestering and all about carbon and nitrogen and stuff. So if you want anything more explaining, then or just drop a comment in here and we'll chat through it in a second. So you mentioned just a bit further ago about sustainability.
Yep.
So what do you mean by that?
Well, obviously there's the there's the traditional sustainability that everybody thinks about in terms of the environment, which is absolutely hugely important. Making sure that we've got a planet that's fit for the next generation and for the next crops even is absolutely paramount from a farming point of view. We'd be silly not to think about it like that, because whilst we can do with a lot of things, we can do without a lot of things. I'm pretty sure we could do without iPhones and Android phones and quite a few other things and people that I could mention, professions that I could mention. You can't do without food. So it's really important that we look after that. But it goes further than that, as far as I'm concerned. There are other sustainabilities that you have to think about in terms of the farm and also running a joined-up business like the farm and the brewery and the distillery. And that's you've got to look at the sustainability of the people as well that you employ. You've also got to look at the sustainability of the product. How replicatable is that? Can we make sure that it's consistent? Can we get the right staff, of course, to make sure that it's consistent? And finally, you've got to make sure that the business is sustainable as well, because if it's built on a wing and a prayer, effectively undercapitalized, or it doesn't have certain things in place to be able to make sure that you can continue both financially and from a workplace point of view, then I'm afraid it all falls on its head, and it's just it can very easily just degenerate into a hobby. So I'm very passionate about all of that.
Definitely. So just to tie into that as well, so Tom's been talking about sustainability of the land, and another thing that we've always been focused on here is about wind power. So you can't really tell tonight because it's an absolutely glorious evening. It's a bit chilly actually, but an absolutely glorious evening. And today we've had sleet and hailstones and every type of weather.
Yeah.
But just this evening the winds dropped and the sun came out for a bit, although it really is still very cold. I think I was a bit optimistic setting us up out here. So one of the things that we've always focused on is wind power. So we first had planning permission for wind turbines back in the 1990s, but the proximity to a big RAF base meant that that wasn't possible and feasible then. Then I think since the mid 2000s, we've had 2 smaller wind turbines, and they've provided a significant amount of energy now, both to the farm and to the brewery. And we're constantly working out ways whether we can capture that and use that for the distillery too, but maybe that's just a bit too far away.
Yeah,
at the moment. And then something else to add just onto what Tom was talking about with direct drilling is all of these trials are trying to get us to a way that we can start talking properly about a carbon neutral, or firstly a carbon neutral barley. So we're trying to walk before we can run,
and also maybe even a carbon negative barley, which means that we can actually take carbon in and use that to offset it against some of the production processes that we've got. Yeah, and
then that can therefore in itself lead in the future to a carbon neutral beer and then a carbon neutral whiskey as well. So those are our grand ambitions at the moment for all of this trialing that we're doing. It's not just about the farm itself, but it's definitely about how that affects the whiskey and the beer too. Yeah. So if there's any questions, hang on, there's a few coming up, so just bear with me now whilst I'm trying to let's see. So Mikey Swan, he's a good friend of the distillery, says, when can we expect the next bottle of single malt Tom and Jenny? Which is a brilliant cue into a nice plug for Muscatel Finish, which is our current release, if I can point it the right way. So this is our Muscatel Finish. So we launched this about a month ago. A month and a bit ago. It's primarily aged in bourbon casks and then finished off in Muscatel casks. It's selling really well. Gives it an extra layer of flavor and depth and detail. Sorry, I'm just leaning over you to put that there. And that's available on the website at the moment. And then in terms of other single malts, then we've got lots of things in the plan that we're working really hard on behind the scenes at the moment.
Yep.
And we're hoping to get those out to you later on in the year as well. And then if there are any other questions, anything else you fancied adding?
No, I don't want to bore everybody to death. And it's quite
chilly.
I have to say it's quite chilly. I think, Jenny, you've chosen the most drafty part on the farm. Even though there's not much wind, it still seems to be.
It still feels
cold.
It is quite chilly here. If there are any other questions, I know there's some comments here. So thank you, Jason, for your comment about the farm to bottle process. So we've tried to incorporate that more into the bottle. So I won't put it on because it's quite a big comment and it will take up the screen. But one of the things that we do with the bottle is on top of the roundel here, you can see. It might go back. Oh no, that's the right way around. It's from field to bottle, and that's something that we really try and push. Like lots of people and lots of distilleries can talk about grain to glass. Sorry, I'm just dropping things all over the floor. Lots of people can talk about grain to glass, but actually the concept of being field to bottle is really important to us. And I know that that's something that a lot of the Scotch distilleries hold dear to themselves as well, and actually indeed some of the English ones
absolutely,
too.
Yeah.
So it's something that we're really focusing on. And we're trying to get across, so lots of that embossing on the bottom of the bottle. Not only is that supposed to represent the tide coming out and the waves and the ripples that the waves leave on the beach when the tide goes out, but it's also about the kind of the markings on the soil during the normal process of production.
Well, we might have to take those off because they're more like
they're more like flower furrows. I know suddenly that's as I was talking about that. Maybe there's a bit of disconnect here, but also we did. And there's also lots of things about the clouds in the sky as well. So that's all about how we pull the natural process into everything that goes onto the bottle. And we try very hard to bring that into the bottle itself. But if you think there's more we can do on that, then that's great as well. So one last comment here, which is about how has COVID-19 affected our plans. Well, unfortunately, the distillery is closed to visitors, and that's, I think, the greatest shame for us about that is that we have a fantastic team who would usually be effusively welcoming everyone to the distillery, onto tours, and to the coffee shop. We missed seeing people at Easter. We have a really lovely group of regulars who are in the coffee shop each week, and you can usually tell which day it is by when you go into the distillery because of who happens to be in the coffee shop at that time.
And which cars are in the car park.
Exactly, and which bikes are parked next to the distillery as well. So I think that's been the massive effect, is that we've had to pause quite a lot of the face-to-face stuff that we would do, but we've been able to keep working safely in the background, and we're looking forward to being able to gradually and safely bring people back and get things back to a more normal state reasonably soon, or as soon as is reasonably possible. So I think before I just get torrents of abuse from people on the comment section about my farming knowledge, I think maybe that's time to wrap things up there. And anything else you'd like to add just before we finish?
No, well, it's really, I think one of the things that just to sort of reiterate, really, it's really quite it's from a farming point of view, it's very satisfying seeing something that you produced on the farm from right from scratch, often a year and a half ago, toddle down the road 10 miles to Muntons, be malted, brought back here again, and then converted into either beer and whiskey, is very, very satisfying. And actually, it almost creates like a loop, which I find quite reassuring, and I'm happy about, really.
And on that note, I think we'll leave it there. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll see
Thanks, everybody.
See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.